read 3 to 5 books every single week and 6 to 10 research articles because I am a doctoral candidate. But I want to share one of the books that I am reading with you chapter by chapter, and we are on the last chapter of Pedagogy of the Oppressed. We're on chapter 4. I believe that chapter 4 is the most important chapter in this book because it ties 1 through 3 together, and we start to have the conversation about culture. And so this is education through the lens of cultural revolution. And I'm really going to have this conversation and connected to a conversation I was having last year when I was in France at Cannes Lions. That is the advertising and marketing like Super Bowl of the world. And this theme in this conversation of culture kept popping up, and nobody was explaining what culture is. It was, advertising and marketing and creating culture. But I found it strange that nobody, one, was having a conversation about culture through the lens of historical preservation. And so that sparked a red flag in my mind, because if we're not having a conversation about the origins, that means by default, this conversation by some way, shape, or form is either the manipulation of stories and historical narratives or the exploitation of them without giving ownership. And I think that's also one of my biggest disdains with AI, because you're not understanding the history of things. You're not actually researching if you can just take tidbits. And what happens when we are venturing into a society, when we don't understand the tidbits that we're taking from historically. But going back to chapter 4 and having this conversation about culture through the lens of freedom, culture through the lens of the fear of freedom, one of the quotes from here, that it said, the cultural revolution develops a practice of permanent dialogue. Again, understanding culture means that you understand history, you understand the shoulders in which you stand on, you understand the historical narratives of not only those who are the victors in society, but those who are oppressed. And we bring the stories of those who were oppressed to the forefront. And we also protect history through the lens, of cultural appreciation, not appropriation, but appreciation. And there's also this dialogue between the community, between the leaders, between the people, between the community, again, going back to where everybody's voice is being heard, coming back to this conversation of dialogue through the lens of humility, through the lens of everybody's voice matters. And when I'm thinking about this through a scientific lens, I think about this through cultural-based research and connecting this to the book fairs in which I am partnering and building. And I am specifically working with the Mayor's Youth Council. So the youth, their voice is heard because their voice is valid. And I think too often we live and treat children, we live and treat teenagers as othered, because children are an oppressed group of society, and a lot of times their voice is not heard. It is excluded. And so when we're talking about what does shaping the future look like, who are the future leaders, we have to ensure that we're making space for the youth and their voice is heard and not suppressed, because their lived experience absolutely matters. Because also, the world in which they're growing up in an AI-mediated world, looks vastly different than you and I. And so if we're not understanding those pain points or those lived realities or those narratives, again, tying this back to the conversation of culture, why are we intentionally excluding their voice out? And I think an answer to that question could be that we see the true disparities. We get to see the true impact. We get to see the true have and have nots, especially when we're speaking about the vantage point of the youth and having the different narratives from youth that come from different neighborhoods, right? And education, again, when we think about what is the goal of education, it is to live a self-sustaining life. When we think about the goal of education, it is to understand history, it is to understand the arts, it is to understand mathematics, it is to understand technology. But when we are intentionally cropping and opting certain dialectic exchanges out, we have to ask why. This chapter is also really important because it breaks down oppression through different lenses, like cooperation, through manipulation, through organization, through unity, in the lens of liberation. And I think this chapter in itself is just so important for us to have an honest conversation in what does it mean to be a community and move forward. And also, not leaving dialogue just to talk, but also dialogue in action. What does that mean to put your money where your mouth is, essentially? What does that mean to be a woman or be a man of your word? What does that trust look like in action? What does showing up for people actually look like? And also, there was this conversation about critical reflection. And I think we collectively hold this conversation of critical thinking, but the importance of critical reflection is that it challenges and leverages and educates naive minds in naive levels of knowledge. It requires you to look at the world at large. And I think when we are speaking about critical reflection and how one gets there, I think a lot of times people just say, oh, you just need to read. But I think it's important to be specific on what are you reading. Again, going back to one of the very first points that I made, when people are just reading like tidbits and trying to create critical dialogue from that, their response or rebuttal to you is, well, I did read. And so, again, having the importance of literature in conversation and in conjunction with the importance of history and in the importance of like arts and technology, we start to see the intellectual heartbeat of education beyond classroom. We see the intellectual heartbeat of community, of dialogue. We also start to see how this begins to birth hope. Right? Going back to what chapter 3 was all about. We start to see how this starts to birth liberation, how it starts to birth love, and understanding really the importance that one conversation can blossom into. But for us to have these conversations that are open, to have these conversations that act as blossoms in flowering moments, we also have to understand the importance of the tone of voice. And also understand, how are we actually educating people without shaming people? And I think that a lot of people, that is one of the toughest pills to swallow. Because you have to understand that people aren't coming from your vantage point of life. You don't know how hard it is to navigate life when nobody in your family is literate. You don't know how tough it is when you're the only person in your family that has a 12th grade education, a 10th grade education. And so having dialogue, again, going back to dialogue within humility, that is the humility in which we are referring to. That is also the oppression that I think I need people to understand when we're talking about literacy. What happens when that has been like the building blocks, not only to your family, but millions of families, billions of families. And so I think this is an important conversation for us to really have from a lens of empathy. I think this is an important conversation for us to have from a cultural preservation perspective, a historical narratives perspective, a digital humanities perspective, an ethical technology perspective. I think this conversation in this book is something that everybody should read, not only to understand community, but also understanding, softening your heart, and engaging in dialogue where you are actually listening, and to have these ears of compassion.